Ready? There is no duty upon the court to comment upon the evidence at all. All the court has to do is render a verdict of guilty or not guilty, where people waive a jury and submit the matter to the court. I usually give to counsel and those people interested in the case the court's reasoning, how the evidence appears to the court. As I say, I am not going to attempt to comment on all of the evidence. There is no duty on the court to comment on it at all. Suffice it to say that if this defendant's story is to be believed, he is not guilty of murder or even manslaughter. If his story is to be believed, he did not even cut the man. The man stabbed himself or got cut in the scuffle, if he is to be believed. I do not mind saying to you that it is hard to believe his story. His story is quite unbelievable. It does not ring true that this man can go into a bar 2 or 3 times and there be no objection by reason of his nationality, but on this particular occasion, the last time, the deceased comes up to him and calls him a vile name and starts to struggle with him with a knife. Now, counsel, things just do not happen that way. If that was all the evidence in the case, why, I would have to find the defendant not guilty, but I cannot believe his story. Now, on behalf of the state, one witness, the girl in the case, Rosemary, was not very helpful, but it does appear that this defendant lived with this girl for over a year, and that only a week or 2 previously she had left him. All right, so he contacts her there in this bar, according to her story, and according to her story, the defendant wanted to buy her a drink, and she refused. So indefinite though her testimony was, it does show that there was some friction between the defendant and this Rosemary. Now, on behalf of the other witness for the state, Mrs. Carter, she told a very clear and convincing story which jibes with all the facts in the case. She said that this defendant came there early in the afternoon and was quarreling and having trouble with Rosemary. The deceased tried to get him to stop and finally put him out of the place sometime during the afternoon. Later, the defendant came back after having the trouble in the afternoon and again had some contact with the girl Rosemary. When the deceased tried to get him to sit down at a table and behave himself or leave, he pulled out a knife. It appears very much to the court as if this defendant knew that he was going to have trouble there. He came back looking for trouble. In any event, if the fight started as he says it started, he certainly used more force than was necessary to defend himself. I will have to find this defendant guilty. I do not believe his story at all. I think the state has proved beyond all reasonable doubt that this defendant stabbed the deceased and brought about his death. The defendant says he did not mean to kill him. He did not mean to kill him, but he did mean to do him severe bodily harm, and death resulted from the injuries received by the deceased from this defendant. I will find the defendant guilty of manslaughter and sentence him to 10 years in the penitentiary. Reverend, I wish you would go out with him and explain to him. Just go out with him and explain to him what I said. I want him to understand. Excuse me. All right, so let's get back to our literary material called Nurture Your Spirit. Ready? My trip began with a Bloody Mary toast with Dr. Sporty. He was my friend first, so cocktails in flight were a must, and the fun people who sat next to and around us. It wasn't until the last third of the flight that I learned one couple was, in fact, a court reporter and a judge. In hindsight, I'm grateful I didn't learn that early on, or Dr. Sporty would have been bored to tears by the shop talk and likely would have taken his aggression out on me during the first mountain boot camp session. This undertaking certainly pushed my limits. While we mostly stayed on the hiking trails, we took some rebellious detours and hiked far off the required beaten paths. At the time of one of the rocks in Garden of the Gods in Colorado Springs, I realized the lessons I was learning along the trail were synonymous with our professional ones. Climbing the mountainsides of Red Rock was a challenge for me with my balance issues, including my occasional bouts with vertigo, but the hike reminded me of the career challenges we face and how we thrive by the achievement of getting through them. It's not about how you get to the destination, but how well worth the journey is. I never would have enjoyed the view from the top any other way. Okay, all right, back to some jury charge practice. The subject of this jury charge is duress. Ready? Plaintiff brings this action seeking to recover the sum of $5,000 and interest upon a written instrument or promise to pay this sum to plaintiff. This instrument is in evidence. Defendant admits that he made and signed this instrument, and as defense thereto alleges, first, that there was no consideration for the execution of the instrument in question. Second, defendant alleges that the instrument in question was obtained from the defendant by duress, that plaintiff, being armed with a revolver, threatened to shoot and kill defendant if he did not sign the instrument. Because of such threats, and in fear that plaintiff would carry out his threats, defendant was compelled to sign said instrument. The instrument sued upon in this action is a written promise to pay money. It is not a negotiable promissory note and does not carry with it the same presumptions as a negotiable instrument. Such a written promise to pay, if it is found to have been given for a valuable consideration, is valid and enforceable in law, unless some valid defense thereto is shown. The first defense set out by the defendant is that there was no consideration for this note or instrument. A valuable consideration may be any advantage or benefit to the person making the promise, or any detriment or injury to the other party. A promise by one person to pay money to another cannot be enforced unless such promise is given for some valuable consideration. And that will conclude our literary and jury charge practice.